All right, well, I'll kick it off here. First of all, good day, everybody. Thank you once again for the opportunity to be a part of the ATARC Zero Trust Lab. Really is something that we are very excited to present to you today, a very compelling solution around the identity security offerings for Zero Trust. So I'll kick it off here with introductions. My name is Miguel Sian. I'm a Senior Vice President of Technology at Merlin Cyber. We are a veteran-owned small business headquartered in Tysons, Virginia. And we've been serving the federal government for almost going on 25 years now. We are a cybersecurity solutions provider, and we do that by working with best-in-class industry-leading cybersecurity software companies, along with emerging technologies that are aligned with the Zero Trust pillars. So at Merlin, I lead a team of solution architects, cybersecurity engineers, client success managers, program managers under the Merlin Labs umbrella, where we help government clients understand their current state of IT, their mission objectives, what's challenging to achieve those objectives. And we work with them to provide solutions to help them meet their objectives. And as you can imagine, more recently, there's been a lot of requirements and requests around complying with the Zero Trust mandates in the executive order. So it's been keeping us quite busy at Merlin. Many of the solutions that we've provided government over the last few years have allowed them to meet many of the objectives of the ZTA, such as gaining comprehensive visibility of all their endpoints, the ability to detect and respond to threats, as well as protecting their most critical assets. And we do that, again, by working with many of the leading cybersecurity software companies that a lot of them are actually involved in the Zero Trust Lab. So today, we are joined by our partner in identity security, and that, of course, is CyberArk. And I'm going to turn it over to Troy Grubbs, who leads as Director of Sales over at CyberArk. So Troy, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you, Miguel. I appreciate that. Hello, everyone. I'm Troy Grubbs. I do lead our federal team here at CyberArk. Very pleased to join you today. Just want to provide a brief overview of who we are, where we came from, our market, focus on the federal government, and then I'm going to turn it over. We'll get into our presentation. A little bit about our history. For those of you who don't know CyberArk, maybe you're not familiar with us, we have been around for a while, about 24 years. We started as really more of a development company, developing a variety of different products. We formulated more of a focus on identity over the years. And for the past 10 years, we've been serving the federal government, growing year over year. We're in all areas of the business. So we serve DoD, civilian, and the intel community. We've established ourselves over those years as the market leader, not just in federal, but in the greater world market. If you look at where we fit on, say, a Gartner Magic Quadrant or a Forrester Wave, we're typically kind of that top right position. And we're very happy to be part of what we're seeing is more of a trend of moving from perimeter-based security as the most primary mission to identity-based security. We're also been kind of at the very beginning of Zero Trust, where we fit in helping an organization accomplish their goals to have an architecture or a framework around Zero Trust. And as Miguel mentioned, we do also work to help organizations with their executive order and mandates and OMB guidance, CISA guidance. My apologies. And we have a different approach to help them understand where we fit with other players in the market. As we'll go through this slides, you'll see that we do support over 250 different technology vendors and their implementation, so we fit seamlessly in any agency's organization, any architecture. Within our federal market, we have seen year-over-year growth. We've been delighted to work with folks like Merlin Cyber and a variety of partners and integrators in accomplishing the mission of serving the government. That being said, I want to get into the presentation slides. I'm going to turn it over to Matt Tarr, Senior System Engineer for CyberArk.
Perfect. Thanks, Troy and Miguel for the introduction. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into the bulk of the content that we have for today's session. To frame my time a little bit, I'm going to go through some slides for 12 minutes is my target for slides. And then I'm going to pivot into some live demonstration for the second part of the session to really bring some life into the concepts that we'll discuss here up front. And we'll probably do some demonstration for about 30 minutes. That's my game plan for the time usage. So let's just kind of get started here and take a dive into zero trust from the viewpoint of an organization that focuses entirely on the prevention of misuse of identity. CyberArk is focused here because it's the most commonly exploited mechanism used across major cyber attacks, and as it turns out, is a major component in building out the zero trust architecture. If we look at this slide and look to the center and begin with a key statement of never trust, always verify, we quickly focus on a common mantra that's repeated a lot when discussing zero trust. The concept is based on the premise of the removal of the implicit trust between subjects and resources that could make connections and communicate on what was presumed to be a secure network. We know from a tremendous amount of experience and pain that this form of static trust no longer, and very well may have never, truly worked. When we speak of a subject, as defined in NIST and other models, we aren't speaking of just the human end user. We're speaking of the end user as well as applications, machines, and any other non-human entities. This piece is important, and this piece sets CyberArk apart in the identity security market by not focusing solely on the human end user, but taking a holistic approach to protecting the identity of any subject which needs access to a secure resource. Where do we begin? And what do we mean by removing implicit trust? It's really the story of zero trust. It's largely moving away from that mindset that says simply based on network location or an initiation point or a previous authentication. It doesn't mean the request should be trusted. It means you have to embrace this mindset of assume breach, something that we've long talked about at CyberArk. We have to assume that the user or device could be compromised at all and any time. And therefore, on the next access request to a resource, we have to revalidate and re-verify. We can't simply trust them because of a previous relationship we may have had. Similarly to discussing a subject, resources is a deliberately broad term. It could cover data, applications that a human wants to access, but it could also cover computer services or APIs. This is really an important concept to think about. We're not just concerned about human users logging into apps. There's a broader story. In talking about mindset, we know that this isn't a singular approach. There are likely vendors in the market capturing this wild focus that we have on the topic at the moment that say what they provide will allow a customer to be zero trust, which is crazy. There are too many things that you need to do to be zero trust. Identity is but one of many. Your zero trust vendors need to interact well to achieve success, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later in this session. In frameworks like CISA, we see various implementation pillars. There'll be a variety of things that you'll need to do to achieve success, but identity plays a role in all of them. Being foundational to the success of the directive naturally puts identity in a strong position for doing it early and doing it right. Pulling this all together a bit, we have subjects, access, and resources. We've removed that implicit trust. We verify every request, but when access is being given, the other major principle is that of least privilege. We need to deliver that access to resources with the least amount of privilege in order to complete the task, and just for that period of time that it's needed. We'll do this differently, of course, depending on the use case, the subject, and the resource. To give a real world scenario, we'll be able to deliver access to an HR system, for an employee to request a vacation day with far less risk than we will for an HR administrator who could potentially change that employee's salary, or even to a robotic automated process that synchronizes that employee's current salary to the payroll app. With all the various access being given, and no matter how we deliver it, this all needs to be monitored and fed back into subsequent decisions. We'll need to use this information dynamically to enforce policies. We need to take lots of contextual information about past behaviors, current locations, current device, and use all of that to process the next subject access verification on the next resource request. I just gave a few examples of different access types around an HR application, something that's really familiar to all of us. Let's break down that access diversity down a little bit further. We have independent bodies like NIST who have written some very useful material around zero trust. Specifically on NIST Special Publication 800-207 that sets up some interesting and useful advice for organizations and how they can set up and embrace the zero trust architecture. One of the things that they say is that you have to deliver controls in correlation to the associated risk. Think about access as the risk. For example, the example of logging into the HR system. We do need to verify that access, perhaps do some authentication. We need to enforce least privilege to some extent. But the level of control that we're going to enforce there is going to be massively different than when we talk about an administrator who wants to log into our cloud infrastructure as a service platform with strong, heavy privileges. We'll of course need to enforce more control there because it's more likely to be targeted and there's much, much more impact should that access be compromised. Historically, in identity, there have been two ends of the spectrum. And this is all we've really talked about. Full-blown administrative access on one side and day-to-day user-based access on the other side. But realistically, there's this whole plethora of access types that sit between those 2 points. And you see some examples here. The concept is this: we need to apply the level of control in correlation to the associated risk. I, as a user, may log into the HR system just to do a routine request for some time off, as an example. But if my role is within the finance department and I now log into the payments environment, well, that's very different. There's, of course, different levels of risk associated with it, and therefore we need to apply more control on that verification process. And what are those controls? We'll categorize the controls into 5 areas for zero trust. For every subject making a request, whether it's a human or a machine, they want to get access to a resource. We need to implement strong adaptive authentication. We need to approve and authorize that access attempt. Assure that it's secured and delivered with least privilege, as well as continually monitor and attest that access and feed it back into subsequent decisions. How we do that, of course, will vary depending on the access type. We're going to enforce least privilege and approval processes very differently for that full privileged access than we are for, say, that user logging into the finance app or the HR system. And you'll notice that I skipped over one thing here: credential and authentication protection. In the previous slide around assumed breach, we have this assumed breach mindset. Therefore, we have to assume that an attacker is in the environment. They'll look to circumnavigate and move around existing security controls, like hacking multi-factor authentication as an example. We need to implement proactive defenses and detection capabilities around our security controls, and really helps to think about how CyberArk does that with protecting credential stores as a great example. So how does this play out into the greater CyberArk story? Well, in 800-207, there's a really interesting section. It's called Identifying Candidate Solutions. These are basic questions about any solution to gauge how it fits into your architecture, your zero trust architecture. It's really difficult to explain just how closely these factors are paralleled in the expectations that we have within the development of the CyberArk identity security platform. We can see it in this slide. CyberArk has crafted a solution that blends deep security controls across a completely diverse resource environment that not only conforms to these ideals, but it does it in ways that injects simplicity of administration and minimizes user friction. And it does it across human and non-human subjects alike.
Okay.
We're in an amazing position to secure all the different access types and allow our customers to apply the relevant controls based on what that access is. Most identity strategies fail by only focusing on those human users. CyberArk's value and CyberArk's advantage is that we're looking at all of those subjects. We provide that proactive security approach to protecting identities and credentials in the environment. In short summary of the identity security strategy in zero trust architecture, we need to think about a whole bunch of different things. At the top, firstly, we need to implement strong adaptive authentication, meaning that we need to understand the context of the user, the device, their history. We need to continually approve and authorize access. We can no longer rely on that existing relationship or that existing trust that we had, and we need to feed data back into the authentication and authorization process. We really need to embrace a concept of least privilege. It's something that's mentioned many times in the NIST document, giving the least amount of access required to execute on that particular task and allowing that access for only the time necessary. We need to protect authentication and credential sources. This is something that's really of the core functionality of CyberArk, really being able to protect all types of credentials in various ways, separate the user access from the identity that's being leveraged, whether it's a user as the subject or a machine, and continuously monitor. We need to understand exactly what users have done with the levels of access that have been granted. And while we look at that spectrum, right, the amount that we need to understand and continuously monitor as the risk increases, we need to enact those controls. As we've gone through this presentation in the last few slides, I've gone from very high level to now focusing more on CyberArk itself. I thought it'd be interesting to take a quick snapshot of CyberArk as a portfolio. This is what we call the CyberArk Identity Security Platform, and it breaks out some different modules of functionality that we have across the solution. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but I actually wanted to talk through this to prepare for some demo setup that I'll speak to on the next slide. CyberArk's mission, as Troy talked about, is really the prevention of the misuse of identity. We've done it with a strong foundation on protections of privileged access. Privileged access has traditionally been the superhighway of attackers that get in the front door to leverage what they, or to gain access to what it is that they came there for. So this is where we're founded and what's focused at the center. We have various elements at the top that really describe different methodologies that we can use to take a user and elevate their access in various ways, whether it's with Privileged Access Manager, which is our secure vaulting technology, taking a standing account, securing it in a strong way, enacting protections like rotation, and then delivering access based on role-based or attribute-based access control to them. It's about doing the same things for third parties. Vendor Privileged Access Manager is a just-in-time based provisioning method that we can use to bring vendors in very simply to leverage different levels of privilege within the environment. Endpoint Privilege Manager is really least privilege on the endpoint, giving us the ability to give what operating systems traditionally don't. When you're in a Microsoft environment, for instance, you can be an admin or not admin. You can't get the granularity with the default Windows operating system that we can apply with Endpoint Privilege Manager. And on the right, Cloud Entitlements Manager is least privilege in the cloud space, which sort of has the inverse problem. With operating systems, we typically don't get enough granularity. In cloud environments, we have massive amounts of granularity, so much so that we don't necessarily understand all the permissions, and we certainly can't grant the appropriate permissions on every use case. Cloud Entitlements Manager allows us to discover exactly what entitlements users and applications are leveraging within those cloud environments to be able to right-size those privileges. Now, when we're talking about the subject, that's really sort of access and DevSecOps on the left and right. Access is typically associated with that human user. We'll show elements of workforce identity inside the demonstration. This is our capabilities around multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, workforce password management. These elements are really human focused and give access to the elevation techniques I just talked about. On the right, DevSecOps and Secrets Manager is where we give applications identity. It's not enough to describe the application as the service ID that it's using. It's more than that. Think of something like an application that is reaching out to multiple resources. It likely needs different secrets for all of them. We can't define the application simply by the accounts or secrets that it's using. We need ways to give applications identity, strong multi-factor authentications. And this is what we do within DevSecOps and Secrets Manager. So just a few seconds here, or a few minutes maybe on this module slide, really to kind of introduce the use cases and demo setup that we'll walk through for the majority of the remainder of our time. Now, I've rearranged some things for the scenario demonstrations to really fit a little bit more of a flow inside demonstration. So I'm just gonna quickly kind of run through what we'll do for the next 30 minutes. On the left, I've tagged it with whether it's sort of a human-based action or a non-human-based action. And on the right, really kind of focusing on the product module that we'll be talking to. So the first thing that I'll speak to is scenario 11. This is a really interesting one, especially to CyberArk, a user credentials compromise. This is really something that CyberArk traditionally focuses on. And there's really a number of ways that we can do it. I don't have any demonstration, so I'm gonna pop this up to the top and speak to it in slides, but I'll talk to some functionalities around privilege threat analytics, where we can kind of understand that a credential has been stolen. Some mechanisms that we can use for third parties to initiate those types of controls inside CyberArk. And we'll point to one specifically around Proofpoint. I'll take another minute to speak more broadly around our C-Cube Partner Alliance, which is our technical alliance partnerships, and talk about the broad integrations that we have. Now, kind of moving more into the interactive piece of the demonstration, we're gonna drop into scenario 2, which generally is going to be an internal employee. In the scenario, they're doing some tasks that are quite basic and non-privileged. I'm going to give it a little bit of a privileged twist to it. Talking about sort of a cloud-based administrator. I'll introduce you to John for scenario 2. He's going to be working internally on the network. In scenario 1, we'll shift that around a little bit. John will be working, doing the things that he does as sort of a cloud admin or a sysadmin, but we're going to take him out of the environment. We're going to maybe put him on his own machine. Maybe we'll put him at his home office, or maybe doing some work while he's on vacation. Who knows? In scenario 3 and 4, we're going to shift and we're going to talk about vendor privileged access. This is sort of our capability to provision third parties that aren't a part of our identity stack to be able to come in very quickly and leverage privileged access and various access types that we'll protect. And then scenarios 5, 6, 7, and 8, actually all very similar to CyberArk. I think you'll see some massive differences when we talk to just-in-time network access vendors. There'll probably be a lot of differences here, but from CyberArk's point of view, these are all relatively similar. Where we will find differences is in where that application is deployed. So in 5, within a cloud environment, and 6, in a data center. To us, that means that the application stack is probably deployed in some massively different ways. If we're thinking about an application deployed in the data center, it could be a modern application deployed in the data center, but it could also be, an application that runs on something like a mainframe. When we're talking about the cloud, it's probably going to be deployed in some different ways, right? Definitely virtualized, but could be very ephemeral or containerized. We're going to inject secrets into those application stacks much differently depending on how that application is deployed. And that's the big difference for us. So hopefully this is good to kind of prime us for what we'll see inside demonstration. And I'm going to talk again to a couple more slides on scenario 11 before we drop into the live demo. So the first piece around credential theft, right? In the scenario, it depicts a situation where we assume that a credential has been compromised. This is really something that CyberArk focuses on pretty deeply. And what I'm going to talk to in the next 60 seconds here is a capability around a module that CyberArk offers around analytics. It's called Privilege Threat Analytics. There's a particular detection called suspected credentials theft. And this is a really interesting one. Sometimes information can be very handy to take from without outside of the CyberArk ecosystem. So inside this detection, we don't really know that a credential has been compromised, but some platform within the environment has that information. So we can take login information from a source such as a SIM to understand different logins that have happened in the environment. If that login occurred with a credential or an account that CyberArk is protecting, and we don't have a correlating event that shows that a user came to CyberArk and checked out that credential or leveraged it in some way, we know that that credential has been compromised. It's been used outside of the CyberArk ecosystem. Therefore, it has somehow, some way been compromised. We can take action on that. This detection pulls in that information feed, analyzes it against our own internal audit, and if it finds a deviation, it can respond by taking control of that account. And we do it in the way that we've done security control around privileged accounts for a very long time. We'll simply change the credential on it. In this case, we're looking at a domain-based account. We found that it was used outside of the CyberArk solution, and we've responded by resetting that account's password. So this is a capability directly within the CyberArk ecosystem. In this case, taking a feed from something like a SIM to understand that a credential was used. So this is the way that we can do it internally. We also have API interfaces that are available for an external solution. Maybe you've got a source solution that's analyzing this and has also understood that maybe this credential was used or this account was used in a malicious way. We have API interfaces that can leverage the same techniques, as well as a bundle of changes that can happen inside CyberArk. So with just a single call to the API, we can trigger multiple functions within CyberArk to take controls as necessary. We call that CARM, or Adaptive Resource Manager. I also wanted to kind of take an interesting take on a vendor partnership that can do this as well. So within the C-Cubed ecosystem, we have a number of partners, and I'll speak to that in just a second, that can interact in various ways. This relates to scenario 11 very closely, in that another security vendor can have some very useful information, especially when we're talking about potentially allowing an end user to leverage an application with a high amount of privileges. Proofpoint, as an example, has a great amount of intelligence around when a user has potentially been phished. So Proofpoint can analyze that and trigger a response in CyberArk, essentially minimizing that user's level of access to a tolerable degree. So if Proofpoint is indicating that a user could have potentially been phished, we can use that information to limit that end user's access. Maybe we want to cut off the most risky things that user could do, or maybe we want to completely cut off that user's access to gaining any access to applications within the environment. We can take that intelligence from a third-party vendor and utilize it within the CyberArk ecosystem. So a couple different examples of how we could potentially respond to a suspected credentials theft, whether it's detected as a login event in the environment, or maybe we take that intelligence feed from another vendor. The last thing that I'll focus on here before we cut over to demonstration will be the wider portfolio of technical alliance partners in the C-Cubed Alliance. CyberArk really does nothing on its own. CyberArk is a vendor that's built off of integrations with your tools. In the Zero Trust framework, this really is going to apply very deeply to your other Zero Trust access vendors, right? CyberArk is a solution that enables security on other platforms. So while we have a variety of integrations across this board, and you can probably see a lot of different products that you use inside your organization, what we're really built on is deep integration with a variety of platforms to enable secure access to all of them. So that's all I have for slides and slideware. I think I went over my 12-minute mark. I apologize. Sometimes I talk a little bit deeply, but this was kind of the point in the demonstration or the presentation that I'm going to cut into some demonstration. So I'm going to pop up my desktop here and kind of start to dive into some of those concepts that we outlined in Slideware. I'm going to start here where we naturally interact with technology, right? I'm going to play the human interacting with technology as my first step. I'm going to open my laptop and I'm probably going to be presented with a screen that looks something like this. So I talked about John a little bit. I'm going to play a user named John, and what we'll see is just his login process. We want to enact strong authentication really every time we touch technology. And this is the very first touch point for most folks when they get up in the morning, logging into their workstation. So I'm gonna begin that process here with a traditional method, password-based access for John. But that's not the only factor. What we're going to do is we're going to prompt John for a strong authentication to get into this machine. And we can do this across the board, right? Whether it's server access or workstation access. This is really the beginning here in this case of the secure desktop experience. I'll talk a little bit more about the CyberArk identity app, but I'm just going to use another form of authentication here in a security question. Hopefully my demo environment didn't just crash on me.
The demo gods are conspiring against you today, man.
I'm gonna stop sharing and see if I can get this under control. Hopefully my demo environment didn't just spin down from inactivity. I think it was still active. Let's see what's going on here.
Hey, Matt, while you're doing that, maybe we could field some questions at this point.
Absolutely. If there's questions, I'm more than happy to field them while I scramble in my demo environment. I spoke too long. My demo environment is spinning down. This will take a second to get it back active again.
No worries, Matt.
Are there any questions on the line?
Yeah, Matt, if while you're going through here, if you could just mention the components that CyberArk is providing, and while you're interacting with them, that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So predominantly, we're going to be talking about Privileged Access Manager. Is sort of the core technology around the CyberArk solution. It's a secure digital repository layered on it with automations that allow us to rotate static accounts. There's elements of just-in-time based provisioning in there as well, but predominantly built around a secure vaulting technology. Access to that from a human user and an application user are the other big parts that we'll talk about. So CyberArk identity or workforce identity more specifically will be a big part of what we show. Workforce identity is where we can leverage different authentication techniques, as I started to talk about before my demo environment spun down, where we can leverage existing multi-factor solutions, where we can layer on top our own multi-factor capabilities, where we can inject or leverage single sign-on to various cloud portals. So that'll play an element here as well. And the other big sort of product module that we'll talk about is sort of that application identification. So giving strong authentication to applications that need to leverage secrets. And those will also come from the Secure Digital Vault, which is part of the PAM solution. We'll probably talk a little bit about Endpoint Privilege Manager. Secure Desktop is really sort of an offshoot of Endpoint Privilege Manager, giving strong authentication in areas where we traditionally have not, which would be sort of on the desktop level, enabling applications to elevate only when they're strongly authenticated. So those are kind of the modules that we'll be talking through inside the demonstration as soon as I get this environment spun back up.
Yeah, and while Matt is getting that up and while he's presenting, if there are any questions that pop up, feel free to just drop it on chat. We also have Graham from CyberArk, another SC on the team here that can field those questions along with myself. And we'll try to point out what solutions match that Matt is demonstrating as we go through the workflows.
I'd say we're probably just past the halfway point of this process to get myself going here again. So stay tuned for another minute here. We'll be ready to go.
Hey, Matt, there's a question on chat. How does CyberArk deal with legacy and mainframe environments?
So those legacy environments are traditionally going to be handled with the vaulting solution. Accounts that have been enabled to access those environments are going to be managed by the CyberArk PAM solution. Within CyberArk PAM, we're able to sort of take complete control of it, and I'll sort of demonstrate a little bit of that once we get started here, in that we can enable use of those accounts in any way that we'd like to. We can enable strong authentication in front of them, which has traditionally been a very deep trouble spot. So applying strong authentication when accessing a mainframe, either as an administrator or as a user, has been very troublesome. So being able to simply leverage MFA in front of those types of applications is a huge advantage. And then we can sort of add in the deep audit capabilities that the solution brings as well. So we can understand exactly what's happening inside those sessions. With it, we can kind of feed that back into the greater ecosystem to make better authentication decisions as we go. So that's the primary mechanism that we'll use around mainframe access. And one of the biggest things to think about is, right, how do we get strong authentication to one of those applications? CyberArk is able to provide it. And this is definitely where CyberArk differentiates itself, versus more modern identity techniques, like something like a single sign-on that's focused on modern web-based architecture. We can handle that. We can also go back into the more legacy applications like a mainframe and provide strong authentication controls around those as well.
And I do want to just piggyback off of what Matt just talked about there in terms of the vaulting technology that they would use for mainframe. This is one of the area, like as Merlin Cyber and looking at the broader identity security portfolio, there might be some instances where you might need to introduce multi-factor authentication as an example to these legacy systems, like old client server technologies or mainframe, or even PowerShell and things like that you may want to just intercept and add MFA. At Merlin, we do have a complementary solution to CyberArk that allows you to plug in an authentication step to prompt for MFA to things like mainframe systems on premise. So and they are a strong partner to CyberArk in terms of integration. They're part of that 250 ISVs that have built an integration on the CyberArk technology. So I do want to point that out. Richard, if that's of interest, feel free to just send me a note or drop me something on chat. I'd be happy to follow up on that. All right, I think I stalled enough, Matt. Looks like you're back up. Hopefully.
Oh, and I'm talking into mute.
Yep.
Thanks, Miguel. Yeah, so I noticed, I looked down at my clock and I realized I went about 2 minutes over the default time that my environment will automatically spin down. So I went a little bit over there, but thanks for your patience, everybody. I actually just went through that strong authentication to get my user into the desktop as I was kind of checking to see if the environment was up. So I won't go back and cover that. But now I've sort of done that process to get strong authentication into my initial touch point into the technology stack, which happens to be my desktop here for my user John. So now I'm logged into this machine as John. I'm logged in as my non-privileged identity, even though John wields some capability through authorization in the environment to leverage a variety of different things. He's generally going to be sort of a cloud admin or a sysadmin in the traditional data center world. Just because he's an administrator doesn't mean that he needs administrative rights on his own machine. So he's just a user here, and this account doesn't get him anything. So we can even enact controls directly in this area, right? So there's no valid reason that John wants to or should be able to modify his registry, right? So we can use tools to be able to give granularity within the Microsoft ecosystem of what we can and cannot do. So as an example, I can't come in or John can't come in and leverage the registry editor. We can leverage elements that traditionally haven't been thought of. When we think of strong authentication to every application, we sometimes forget about the legacy applications that could be running right here on my machine. So if John wants to leverage something like PowerShell, for instance, that has wide implications of what it can do, we'll allow him to do that if he asserts his strong authentication. Right? So in this case, the process here to run something like a PowerShell will be to reprocess that authentication. I'll enter my my password in that case, but I'll use the mobile authenticator as my methodology to do a secondary authentication here. I'm going to use the CyberArk mobile app. You probably heard a little ringtone in the microphone. I get a message on my screen, just like other multi-factor apps that you've seen, to approve that authentication. Once I approve it, it's going to continue on screen, and it's going to allow me to do a strong authentication for this local Windows-based application. Sometimes that an elevation or usage of an application that's overlooked. We want to apply these strong authentication policies to really any app that we use. I want to start here right on this the first touch point in the technology stack on doing some strong authentications that maybe we should start thinking about doing, right? Add access to our machines when we're running local apps. But when we think about what John might be doing as a part of his job, it's probably going to go beyond this initial IT touch point. We're going to think about what John needs to do to manage access or manage cloud resources or other resources within a data center. Now, to do that, we're going to use the identity security platform to leverage those rights in a variety of ways. I can do it in a number of ways, but the primary method that I'm going to do it is probably to come to CyberArk in a browser. So I'm gonna begin that process, and I'm actually going to drop back one layer so we can go through the full authentication. What I'm presented with here are two options. At the top is a QR code for authentication, and at the bottom is sort of the option to inject my username. Following that, I'll be able to inject other factors like a password or a token-based authentication or whatever I have configured. But I'm going to use CyberArk's passwordless-based authentication. It's based on the QR code that you see on the screen above. I'm again going to open up my CyberArk identity app, the one that I used to approve the notification when I launched PowerShell. But this time, I'm going to use the QR code-based authenticator. It's basically going to prompt me to biometrically authenticate to my device. I'm going to do that with a thumbprint in my case. And then I'm going to point the phone camera at the screen at the QR code. That's going to place my strong authentication to my device in front of the console and strongly authenticate me into the CyberArk solution. Now, the really nice thing about that is that it's passwordless. I don't need to mistype a password inside the demo, but I didn't even need to type in my username. So it's completely keyboardless. Now that I've got access into the CyberArk identity portal, I'm going to drop down here to account and talk about some of the different form factors of authentication that we can enable users to bring. I've used a couple of these. I used a security question to get into my desktop. I used a mobile device with a push notification and the QR code screen, but I've got the option to enable users to leverage multiple authentication factors. This can really sort of bring user experience up to the level that we want for the best use of our time or how we want to interact with technology. Completely configurable. We can bring in existing multi-factor solutions. We can leverage our own. We can apply them in policies in different ways. This is where we can use some adaptive MFA policies as well. As we want to ratchet up those controls, we can use specific authentication factors to be able to prove our identity in various ways. But let's get back to what John needs to do. John needs to go do some management in the IT infrastructure somewhere. So I'm going to use CyberArk Identity as a single sign-on pivot point to get into CyberArk PAM. So I'm going to click on a tile, much like you've probably seen 100 times via single sign-on demonstrations. And this is where I'm going to be able to pivot into my more privileged sort of activities. So we'll go through a few things here and kind of demonstrate connectivity in a variety of ways. The first thing that I'll show is sort of traditional data center. And to us, it doesn't really matter. Inside the scenarios, there's a lot of differentiation between SaaS applications, infrastructure as a service, and data center based applications. The technology that we'll use will vary depending on the use case, but generally we're going to follow the existing paths that user has access to. We'll leverage connectors in various places to be able to architect the path between that user and the target system. And if there's no valid, strong, protected path, like could be provided by like an adaptive VPN, that's where we'll leverage remote access to be able to transit that session over a secure technology. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more. But John just needs to do something. So I'm going to take something that's very common, sort of a secondary administrative credential. This is the one that houses privilege for John in the domain-based environment. I'm going to come over here to the right and I'm going to click connect. I'm going to select the target system that I want to go to. This is a domain administrative account. So I'm going to navigate over to the domain controller. I'm going to click connect. And that's all I really need to do as John. CyberArk is doing the rest. CyberArk is leveraging a credential that's being protected in that secure repository. It's automating the retrieval of that credential on John's behalf. It's opening the tool that John wants to interact with, Microsoft Terminal Services Client in this case, and automatically logging him into that asset that we just selected, my domain controller. So I'm doing all this very simply. John doesn't need to see the credential. He sees exactly what we've seen here in the demonstration. We don't need to handle the credential. We can apply some of those benefits that we had before around application control and privilege management. We can still trim things that John has the ability to do, but by and large, John has come here with a highly privileged access. We're able to allow him to process these things unimpeded, but we also get deep auditability. So towards the end of the session, we'll talk about the auditability that we gather here, full video recording, full contextual awareness around the session that John has completed. So that's a typical data center based asset, right? A domain controller inside maybe the data center. Let's pivot that out into some different access. Infrastructure as a service, as an example, into maybe an Azure Portal. So very similarly, I'm going to identify an account that gives me access in that direction, and I'm going to use that connect button. We're going to get a different behavior here. Instead of launching Microsoft Terminal Services Client, what you're going to see is a web browser launch. And what we're going to do is a very similar thing. We're going to automate the credential retrieval from the vault. We're going to plug it into this workflow. And one final thing that you'll see is a second approval request. And this is going to be an authentication that's assigned to this account, John, at Matt Tarr CyberArk Outlook, right? This account is also using multi-factor authentication. And again, my timing was a little short on that one. I didn't approve it on my end fast enough, so I'm just going to go back through it again. Basically, I'm going to pull out the Microsoft Authenticator app on my phone. So leveraging a different authentication type, just here as an example, I'm going to go through that process of CyberArk injecting the credential, and it's going to push a notification out to me. I'm going to approve it in a reasonable amount of time this time, and it's going to process that login. So in this case, we're taking an Azure AD account that's only an Azure AD in this particular case. We've assigned strong authentication to it. CyberArk is going to manage part of the credential, which would be the password. We're also applying strong multi-factor authentication to it at the source, which is the Microsoft Authenticator. We're able to combine these two together to get authentication at not only the initiation point of CyberArk, but also out on that target resource. So John has a limited set of permissions in Azure. Maybe there's a task that he needs to complete on with additional privileges. So I'm going to sort of step this up a little bit and leverage a break glass account. So we've got an account loaded in with global administrative rights, and we're going to have John access this. We're going to step up the level of authorization needed to do this. So now when we connect, we see some more information that we need to input. The first one is a reason for access, which tends to be the same for me, always on a demonstration. But we're also integrating with a ticketing system. So this is what we can use for automated authorization of requests to access systems. So in this case, we'll validate against ServiceNow. We'll put in a valid ticket ID and hit connect. We're going to authorize against that incident. We're going to validate a variety of points, whether it's that the ticket is in a particular state, that John is authorized to use it, really a variety of methods. We're going to inject the credentials being used to access that account. And now John's going to have break glass access through an automated mechanism using an ITSM ticketing system to authorize that wider access that he'll receive through this break glass account. So again, an additional point of authorization that we can use. We can pivot into a few different directions, whether it's data center based, whether it's cloud based, SaaS based. I'm going to kind of minimize what I'll show here just in the interest of time, and start talking about the second scenario, which is John moving outside the network perimeter. With this, we're typically thinking about John having access to the resources that are in front of him. If we look at the URL for this web interface, this is a local domain, right? It's a local interface housing this. In this case, the CyberArk PAM solution is deployed within the corporate perimeter. But what if John's outside the corporate perimeter? What if he can't access this web interface? Well, there's a variety of solutions that would enable that. But what we'll do is we'll sort of pivot and we'll position John outside that perimeter and talk about what we call remote access. I'm going to go to a common URL. Alero.io is sort of the initiation place for when anyone needs to come from outside the protected environment and use the tools that CyberArk has to be able to leverage access in various ways. So very similarly, I'm going to be presented with a QR code. I'm going to use a slightly different technique here in the CyberArk mobile app, which I need to log into locally. I'm going to give this a shot, but I don't think my environment came completely up after shutting down previously. It looks like I'm halfway there. So what you'll notice is the same QR code based authentication or a similar technique that we used for John to authenticate into identity was used here for authentication into remote access. Now, this is a different authentication technique. It can be used as a failback authentication mechanism to your primary, but it can also be used from outside of the traditional perimeter. You notice that the URL has changed, and this would be an internet publicly accessible URL based on a reverse proxy technique that would enable John, my internal employee, to be able to leverage the resources within that network perimeter from anywhere that he happens to be and from whatever device that he happens to be on. I've got a single tile here, and this represents access back into that same application that we were leveraging previously. So when I click on it, what I see is sort of that same interface. From here, I can leverage the same technology set that I had previously. We're going to just do one single thing differently once I get back in here from outside the environment. We've got access to the web interface, but we also need access to the systems that I'd like to connect to, and that's what will change slightly. So I'm going to come down here to this account. It's xadmin. It's a domain-based account, and I'm going to click connect. I'm going to see one additional option here. and it's called allow select HTML5. This is our mechanism for secure remote access. Instead of connecting John to our privileged session manager that handles session brokering on an insecure protocol, we're going to follow a secure protocol path back to the environment to be able to connect to whatever asset that we'd like to. And again, this is selectable. It's a domain-based account. He happens to be a domain administrator again. I'll go back to that same location, but I'm going to do it in a slightly different manner. Now, once I use the HTML5 based connection technique, what you'll notice is this connection opens in a browser. I'll sort of point up here to the URL. This URL, again, would be accessible publicly via a reverse proxy technique out into our SaaS service. Also pointing at the fact that I didn't renew my certificate, but the idea is that this is following a secure channel to be able to allow anyone externally that we want to approve the ability to be able to access those protected resources in a very similar way. So I'm going to drop out of this connection. Again, the same properties that we get with session brokering, as we saw with the first connection we showed with John connecting to the domain controller, full audit visibility, et cetera. We're just pushing it over a secure channel. I talked about sort of anyone that we want to authorize the ability to access those resources within the environment. So I'll kind of drop back out to that sort of remote access layer where before I kind of pivoted back directly into PAM. I've also got John set up as someone that can invite third parties into the ecosystem, right, to be able to leverage and access accounts in various ways, as we've been talking about. John has the ability to actually invite a vendor. So if I come down here, we can come in and see different vendors that have been invited. I've already pre-invited one, but I can also come in and go through that process of adding a vendor into the remote access or vendor PAM ecosystem. The idea is this is going to dramatically streamline the process for allowing a third party in to be able to leverage resources to access an application within the environment without fully onboarding them into the application or the identity stack rather. So very simply, we can process this by adding that individual's information. We're going to send out an email to this registrant to be able to begin that process. That process begins with opening the email, downloading the CyberArk mobile app that John had just used to access this application, signing up, registering, and then from there he'd be able to log in just as John had. And I'll show you how that works as a remote vendor. So I'm going to pop open another tab. Same URL, but I'm going to come in. No, first I've got to drop John out of there. I'm going to come in as my vendor that I've pre-registered. So I'm going to log into the app as my vendor. Again, I'm using a biometric authentication on my end, QR code-based scanner on my phone, and we're going to log in now as Joe. Joe is my vendor example that I used to align to the next scenario, right, which is the developer that's accessing the environment remotely. So with this, we're going to get access in the same way that we saw John get access, but we're going to log in as another user. I think I still held John's authentication. Back out, close my tabs. Reopen my app, point it at the screen. And jump in as the vendor that I wanted to go in as. So now I'm logged in as this new identity in the demonstration. Joe vendor is representative of that developer user that needs to leverage different types of access. So I'm going to sort of skip some of the things that I've already talked about just in the interest of time and move into some different examples. So very similarly, right, we can get access over that secure protocol using remote access over HTTPS and allow Joe to access a variety of resources in a variety of different directions. I'll go through a process to get access to a secure cloud console. In this case, I'm going to connect to AWS. This has a strong amount of rights associated with it. So we don't want to just allow this vendor to access it. We want them to go through an approval process. So at right, instead of just connect, we've got this option to request connection. And this implies that we've got a policy associated with it that is going to demand an approval process. This is a human-based approval process where, in this case, Joe's internal representative, we'll use John again in this case, needs to approve the use of this account at this particular time. Joe has access to other accounts that don't require approval process, but just because of the level of risk, we're going to ask for an approval. So I don't know, maybe Joe's coming in under a particular PO or project number. We'll put that in the reason for access. We have the ability to use this account or request to use this account for more than just a single use. And for that, we can request a time frame of access and get use of this account multiple times within that period. For the demonstration, I'm just going to use a single use, and I'm going to go ahead and send that request. I'm going to sort of pivot quickly back into John's view to approve this request. Logging back in as John, under accounts and requests, we see incoming requests. And this is where we see Joe's request to use that AWS vendor account. We can see the information that he wants, the access that he wants, the access type that he wants, as well as that reason. I'm just going to go ahead and confirm that request without any additional information. Now, if I pop back over to Joe's view, you can see that this there's an icon has changed. This request is pending. If I refresh my screen, that should go green, and we'll see that this request has been approved. Over on the right, my request connection has changed to just simply connect. And this is where I'll be able to leverage the connection, just as I had through John's demonstration, leveraging the secure session brokering, injecting this credential that's being protected by the CyberArk vault into the session and logging in securely. I'm going to pop around and do a couple things. I'm going to log into the IAM console. I can use this as a trigger point to understand the context within the environment. I'm going to go take a look at some of the accounts and some of the roles and just pop around to build some context. Then I'm going to go ahead and sign back out. So really just another example of a target system, could be within the data center, in this case, infrastructure as a service console. I'm going to give another example, maybe in the developer context. We need to access an operating system, and we'll kind of diversify a little bit and use a Linux target. So I'm going to use this account. Developer 1 happens to be on a Red Hat box that's within my data center. But again, this could really be positioned wherever that instance happens to be. We'll use a different architecture, or we'll flow through different connectors to be able to get there. But what we present to Joe is really just access to that target that he's looking for. Just a quick check on who I'm logged in as, but then I'm going to do something potentially nefarious, right? Sort of in scenario 11 around credential theft or suspected credential theft. Joe could use his access to this target system to potentially create a backdoor account. There's a few different ways that we could do it. We could do a user ad. I'm going to do an SSH keygen, which would begin the process to finish the command. Begin the process to be able to create an SSH key pair to give me access. So I can do a few different things when I see a command like this. I can audit on it, or I could take immediate action. So in this case, I'm choosing to take this under audit, but we can also pause this session or terminate this session when we see an activity within it that doesn't correspond to a predefined policy that we want to apply. Again, taking audit information and taking immediate actions based on it. So I'm just going to close this session just in the interest of time and pivot again into sort of more of an auditor context. So I'm going to get Joe out of this and jump back into identity. And we'll talk to sort of the last user that I'll use inside demonstration. So I'm going to use Mike. Mike is my admin. He's also my auditor. I'm going to get him authenticated. In this case, I'm going to use a push notification into my CyberArk identity app. Then I'm going to approve, and Mike will get access into my identity console. So kind of talking a little bit about the broad options that we have, right? AWS is one of those use cases that we talked about previously. We can adapt to this use case in a number of different ways. We talked about standing access and vaulting. We can also use federated access through the single sign-on solution. So if I click this tile, we're going to allow Mike, in this case, to get federated access into AWS with his domain-based account. And we're going to layer on some of the things that I'll talk a little bit further about here. Right, the ability to understand contextual information on what exactly was done inside this session. So we're going to go ahead and continue. Mike is going to be dropped into the ability to select his role. He's going to assume this role within the session. You see some information here around secure web sessions popping up on screen that allows us to get that contextual information. Top of the screen, you'll also notice that my browser plugin has switched from just the shield into the shield with recording icon. And this really indicates that we're getting that visibility into this session without necessarily routing him through the full PAM solution. We're using this through identity and what we call secure single sign-on. So kind of pivoting back into identity, I'm gonna come back here and use it to drop into the PAM solution again, but do it under the context of an administrator, or in this case, really showing functionality of an auditor. So popping back over here into privileged sessions, this is where we can get that visibility into the activities that were conducted within the CyberArk ecosystem. So if I come back here and take a look at some of these things, we can sort of follow the path that we took through the environment. The first thing that we did here inside the demonstration was John used RDP as John_admin to go into the domain controller. If I pop open to get some more detail, we can see exactly what was done. We can play back a full video session. We've already seen that we're tagging some risks inside this session. So we're using the audit that we're recording through session brokering to be able to build context and automatically auditing what we're seeing. So as I move up the stack, we can see some different access types as we went through some different activities, whether it's my user John connecting with a named account, or when he connects with a functional account, or this break glass account for global admin. The big thing here is that we're connecting the human user, right? In this case, John, or the subject to the use of this particular account and access at this time, and given a full list of what was done within it. Now, as I sort of move up the stack, we can do the same things with the external parties, leveraging accounts through the solution. Joe Vendor has come in. He's used AWS console access through that approval process that John approved to use this AWS vendor account. We see a risk score attached to that, and that's really around going into the IAM management console, right? So giving us some indication that with this high risk account, this vendor is coming in to do some high risk activity, and we flagged it. And then that last one, the sort of potential for our vendor coming in, using the privilege that they have to create some form of backdoor. We can use this to audit it as I have with a high risk score. We can also take the opportunity to take action on this session and choose to suppress it with either a pause or a disconnect on the session. So taking immediate action based on the activities that we see within the session. I've covered a lot, and I've tried to speed up the demo portion of this for the time that we missed in between. The last thing that I'll touch on here inside the active demonstration, I talked about it a lot through slides, so I'll mention it here quickly, is the non-human identity piece of this. I'll just give a couple quick examples of what we're talking about, or sort of some of the methods that applications can use to leverage accounts to secure access for applications. So really, the approach is to be able to inject secrets in a variety of ways. One of the approaches is to simply update the source of that application ID or secret that application is coming through and consuming. So when we think about things like the Microsoft ecosystem, like Windows services, this is how we do it. We constantly keep that credential in sync. Maybe it's a third-party application that uses a configuration file to store a secret. This isn't the greatest, but it's better if we're continually rotating this type of account. So what we can do is we can rotate the account and we can push the update into the place that it's being stored. But as a better step, we can leverage an API and allow that application to bring its identity to be able to prove itself to CyberArk and access the secrets that CyberArk is protecting. So as an example of that, I'm going to pivot into just a PowerShell script to show what that could look like. Within this PowerShell script, really basic, it's not doing anything of much consequence other than retrieving a credential and displaying it on screen. What we don't see here is the credential itself. It's being retrieved from the PAM solution. And what we see is just sort of that string. What we want to do is simply get that password. And that's what we're enabling this script to be able to do. It's going to prove itself in a few different ways. One of the primary being delivering a certificate to the CyberArk solution to be able to prove its identity. So when we run it, it's able to retrieve the credential that it needs to use within.
Let me turn this thing down here.
Within the CyberArk vault, without having that that credential hard coded within it.
Is there a stock pick today? NASDAQ is taking a beating.
Okay, everyone, please mute yourself. Chris, can you go ahead and mute that person? Sorry about that.
No worries. I think that was also signaling that I've been sort of at the podium for quite a bit of time in my demonstration. Lost a bit of time, so I worked through some of the use cases a little faster than I expected. Hopefully the pace was okay for everyone. Hopefully I covered the scenarios that I intended to in a little bit more of an abbreviated time. So with that, that concludes the demonstration for CyberArk. I'll hand it back to the team to see if there's any questions that are outstanding.
Thank you, Matt. That was great. Does anyone have any questions for Matt before we transition here in the next couple minutes? Okay, well, thank you so much. And if anyone wants to be put in touch for further discussion on this, happy to help make those connections. Otherwise, the recording will be posted to YouTube. But thank you all. We really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks again, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thanks. Okay, Chris, you can go ahead and stop recording, and then we will have our next presenters